Hi fantasy fiction fans, and welcome to Myth and Magic, a fantasy writer's kit bag. I'm fantasy writer Neil Mach, the author of Moondog and the Reed Leopard, and I want to share my love of folklore, local history and nature mythology with writers and creatives like you on my regular podcasts. It's designed with fellow indie publishers and writers in mind, but all fans of fantasy fiction are very welcome to join in. In my fantasy writer's kit bag, writers, artists and creatives will find lots of ideas and discussion about things such as potions, dark arts, fabulous creatures, folktale studies, nature lore, and the interesting history behind the myth and magic that underpins our understanding of the fictional universe. Hello fantasy fiction fans, and welcome to Myth and Magic. I'm just back from my trip to Morocco. The winter sun was splendid and it was a bit rough, I have to be honest, coming back to the soggy old rainy Britain. And it's true that I've been away for 18 days during the past month on trips to Rome, and then Malaysia, and then obviously most recently North Africa. Now I promise I'll tell you all about my adventures in the new year, but this week I thought I ought to concentrate on Christmas time myth and magic. And where better to start than the myth of Father Christmas. Now nothing awakens the interest of a young mind in the subject of myth and magic more than the story that's made annually and almost made true, that's all about Santa Claus. This beloved character brings together religion, mythology, history, mysticism and fantasy in a way that is not only fascinating and compelling, but also becomes legitimate at this time of the year. And although disconcerting and quite esoteric in nature, for example, is Santa Claus an elf? Is he a saint? Is he a supernatural entity? Or is he merely a marketing device created by shrewd business people? At least everyone gets what Father Christmas is all about, even though they can't put into actual words what there is to understand about him. And I think that's about as esoteric as you get these days. And it's not often in this rational and modernistic world that we see an acceptance that something exists or is true, even though there's absolutely no proof of its actual existence. The belief in Father Christmas is just relying on hope, trust and optimism. I often think that it's entirely possible that in this world of humanism, science and rational thought, Father Christmas is the last vestige of a belief in the miraculous, the paranormal and the otherworldly. And if it's difficult for me, a fantasy fiction writer, to see how this creature clearly belongs outside the material realm and yet is welcomed into our hearts and our minds and even our homes at Christmas time, then it must be doubly difficult for those logically minded folk out there to get their heads around him. And yet they do. In fact, Father Christmas is even tracked by the ultra-high-tech North American Aerospace Defense Command, the NORAD system, and he's also tracked by the Russian aerospace equivalent called GLONASS, as he journeys around the world on his mission to deliver presents to good children. Even more amazingly, even though he's a supernatural entity from an entirely different space and time dimension, he's associated with a holy Christian festival. Now, how did that happen? If you've been listening to my show over the last months, then you won't perhaps be surprised to know that the character we know as Father Christmas probably reaches way back in time and is most likely connected to the Odin or Woden wandering wizard figure that I've mentioned before in several episodes. And the reason you won't be surprised is because the Odin Woden wandering wizard figure is normally seen as a white bearded old man with white hair and with a cape and a hood. And the old man's mystical nature might also have given you a clue. Our Father Christmas is also said to be a fairy or a magical being, and I would like to suggest that he's connected to Woden. So, to be frank, Norad is probably tracking Woden in his disguise as the wandering wizard of the hunt. So, where do we start? Let me try to start with something that you'll get your head round, and that's with reindeer. It's as good a place as any to start. So, reindeer, also known as caribou in the north of America, are probably one of the oldest domesticated animals known to man, although actually they're semi-domesticated. They've been hunted by man since before the mists of time. In fact, scholars suggest that they may be the single most important hunted species on the planet. They were known by the ancient Greeks and the Romans as a vitally important hunt species, but of course were hunted long before the Greeks and the Romans. Domestication of the deer by the Arctic peoples probably started between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, when the animals that the people lived alongside began to be herded as livestock rather than hunted as prey. These indigenous people who lived close to the Arctic Circle employed their deer to pull sleds, and they raised their deer for meat and for hides and for antler and to use as tools and for milk. The deer were not completely domesticated though, as I say, they are semi-domesticated because they tend to migrate between coastal and inland areas. Therefore, the herders normally travelled with the herds and lived a nomadic life alongside them. By the way, in modern times, during World War II, the Soviet army used reindeer as pack animals to transport food, ammunition and post, and to bring wounded soldiers and equipment back to base. And they used about 6,000 reindeer, and they used about 1,000 reindeer herders as part of their operation. Anyway, back to ancient people, the Arctic people of the Iron Age. Now, try to imagine, if you can, a white-out. Have you ever heard the expression, a white-out? A white-out occurs when the land, covered in crisp white snow, meets a whitewashed snowfield skyline. In other words, everything is white. Imagine if you encountered a whiteout and you glimpsed a team of reindeer pulling a sled across a ridge in the middle distance. Now, remember, the ridge is white, the sky is icy white, and even the foreground between you and the deer sled is icy white. The sleigh and the reindeer would appear to be flying across the sky. Now, imagine this vision was at night, and because in wintertime, don't forget, the night time for the Arctic peoples is never ending, and imagine the sleigh is adorned with twinkling lanterns. What do you think it would look like? How do you think that would look to an observer? Anyway, Jule, J-U-L-E or Y-U-L-E, or Yuletide, is an ancient midwinter festival celebrating the wild hunt and the very deep folk memory of those deer herds that I talked about earlier. Yule also celebrates the god Odin Woden in his guise as the wanderer hunter, and the lighting of candles in memory of female ancestors. And the lighting of candles normally took place on the Night of Mothers, which is the 24th of December, the date which is Christmas Eve to us. Although remember, I'm talking about a period long before the advent of Christianity. Odin Woden, in his guise as the Winter Wanderer, bears the name, in this case, Yulefather or Yulefather. Yulefather or Yulefather. And in this guise, he's depicted as an old man with a white beard, wearing a cloak with a hood, and he holds a magical staff. And in his guise as the Yulefather, he rides a white horse across the sky. The word Yule, by the way, is still used today in Nordic countries to describe the winter holiday season. The word Yule is still used in Nordic countries to describe the winter holiday season. And according to the saga of Håkon the Good, written in the year 934, Yule was celebrated over 3 nights, starting at midwinter night. Big feasts were arranged and sacrificial blood was drunk. In folklore, the pre-Christian wild hunt is a motif that typically involves a ghostly or supernatural group of hunters who pass by in wild pursuit. These hunters might be elves, fairies, or even the dead. And the leader of the hunt is often the Odin figure. At Christmas time, I suppose the leader of the hunt is the Yulefather. But he might be joined by the Thor character, and Thor rides across the sky in a chariot pulled by goats. The wild hunt is a phenomenon known across cultures. For example, in Scandinavia, it's known as the Ride of Asgard. In Britain, it's known as Vorden's Hunt or Herod's Hunt, Cain's Hunt, or the Devil's Dandy Dogs in Cornwall, or Gabriel's Hounds in North England, and it's known as the Ghost Riders in North America. A reliable eyewitness account of the wild hunt, written in the 12th century in England, describes it as thus. The huntsmen were black, huge and hideous, and rode on black horses and on black goats, and their hounds were jet black, with eyes like saucers and horrible. This was seen in the very deer park of the town of Peterborough, and all the woods that stretched from the same town to Stamford, and in the night the monks heard them sounding and winding their horns. By the way, the Romans considered the Odin figure to be the same god as their Mercury, and they considered the ancient Thor figure to be the same as their Hercules. Anyway, going back to Yuletide, in processions during Yuletide, it was common for European young men to parade and congregate in masks to celebrate the wild hunt. It's generally agreed that the hunters of the wild hunt probably came from a fairy otherworld, in other words, another dimension. Over the ages, the hunt was led by popular characters of the time, such as Gwydion, King Arthur, King Herla, and also Herne the Hunter. Now, if dark horsemen might move magically across a winter sky, accompanied by black ravens and black war dogs, and they seem to merge with the darkening clouds on a distant horizon, it's easy to see how this mental image might be frightening for children. So the emblem of the wild hunt became replaced by something more friendly and more wholesome, especially for children. And this was after Christianity had spread across the northern realms. And don't forget, the last areas of Europe that were Christianised were the Baltic regions. And this was as late as between the 12th and the 14th centuries. So the idea of a gentle, warm-hearted figure riding across the sky with his herd of beasts changed from something frightening from the wild hunt into something closer to our idea of Father Christmas. So now we move on to Saint Nicholas. So how did a saint, in this case Saint Nicholas, get caught up with all this wild hunt? Well, I hopefully will be able to explain. St. Nicholas of Myra, or Myra, was an early Christian bishop who probably lived during the mid-4th century AD, in Roman times, in an area that we now know as Turkey. St. Nicholas had a long white beard, long white hair, and he wore red robes and a mitre because he was a bishop. So he looked similar to the Woden figure of the Yulefather. And because of his many miracles, he's known in Turkey as Nicholas the Wonder Worker. And furthermore, St. Nicholas is the patron saint of children, among other things, and during his life he earned a reputation for secret gift-giving. So it's obvious, I think, that the early church thought that St. Nicholas of Myra was a perfect substitute for the ancient Yulefather. In late medieval England, on St. Nicholas's Day, which is 6th of December, parishes would hold boy bishop celebrations, and part of these rituals, the local youths would perform the functions of priests and bishops and exercise rule over their elders. And it was seen by the church as a good way of diverting attention from Yule and replacing it with the more wholesome image of St. Nicholas in his guise as a bishop of the church. And today, St. Nicholas is celebrated as a great gift giver in several Western European and Central European nations. And according to one source, in medieval times, nuns used the night of the 6th of December to deposit baskets of food and clothes anonymously at the doorsteps of the needy. And this is probably how the custom of secret gift giving at Christmas time came about. So why do we call Saint Nicholas Santa Claus? So the next part of my explanation is Sinterklaas. When I travelled to the Netherlands to visit the Christmas markets recently, I saw the celebration of Sinterklaas, Sinterklaas. The feast of Sinterklaas is celebrated on the 6th of December, a date you'll know to be the date of St. Nicholas. And so therefore Sinterklaas and St. Nicholas are the same person, and the Dutch for St. Nicholas is Sinterklaas. In the Netherlands, when I was there, I noticed and was told about Sinterklaas's assistant. He's assisted in his duties by a figure called Zwarte Piet, or Black Peter, who is one of his companions. And Pete is traditionally dressed in Moorish attire, and he's portrayed with a black face. It's thought that the Pete character is a folk memory of St. Nicholas's real and actual servant, who has been described over the years as of Moorish extraction. Oddly, in modern day Netherlands, Sinterklaas arrives by white horse. He doesn't use a reindeer sledge to get about, like our Father Christmas. But then again, the Yulefather, if you remember, the character of the Wild Hunt, he also rode a white horse across the sky. Is this a curious throwback to the earlier tradition? During the religious reformation of the 16th and 17th century in Europe, Protestant reformers such as Martin Luther changed the saint gift-bringer Sinterklaas from this semi-pagan motif and into the more acceptable Christ child, or Christkindl. And the Reformed Church also moved the date of the Christkindl celebrations from the 6th of December to Christmas Eve. Much of the Netherlands is now Protestant, and it obviously is one of the most important nations to bring about Protestant reform. But I did travel when I was there to an area of the Netherlands which is still to this day predominantly Catholic. But most of the nation changed over to modern thinking, and they consider the Christkindl now to be a more acceptable folk tradition for Christmas time. Anyway, the Sinterklaas story travelled with the Dutch migrants and took root in the Dutch colonies, such as the settlement of New Amsterdam, which is on the tip of Manhattan Island. And I'm sure you already know, but just to remind you, the English took over the settlement of the New Amsterdam and renamed it New York. That was in 1664. But of course, the descendants of the original Dutch families continued to celebrate their Sinterklaas traditions along with the other wintertime festivities, including Christkindl. So that's why Santa Claus and Christkindl kind of start in our imagination in New York, although of course in reality and historically speaking they don't. So finally we move to the actual Father Christmas character. Now in the British tradition from about the 11th century, Father Christmas has been the personification of Christmas time. In this respect he's the same thing as Sinterklaas, and also an entirely different thing. And if that's confusing, then I apologise. And like I said at the outset, this mythical magical entity is very esoteric. So Father Christmas, the personification of Christmas time, can be considered to be synonymous with Santa Claus because he shares a common heritage with the pre-Christian notion of the wild hunt. Nevertheless, the Church in Britain wanted to distance their devotees from pagan traditions, so their Father Christmas, and he was also known, by the way, as Sir Christmas, was presented to the public as a personification of Christmas, and that's how he has been characterised since early times. A very early English carol suggests that Sir Christmas brings news of Christ's birth as he encourages his listeners to drink. Make good cheer and be right merry, and sing with us now joyfully. Noel, Noel. In Britain, the term Yule, Y-U-L-E, was comprehensively replaced by the word Christmas from about the 11th century onwards. And the old Father Christmas, the Yulefather, was gradually moved out of people's sensibilities, and the new Father Christmas personification of Christmas time was brought in, and he was seen as a symbol of the good old days of feasting and good cheer. Though during the rise of the Puritans in the 1640s, who tried to abolish Christmas, folk had to hold on to the belief that the Christmas spirit, in the form of Father Christmas, would still come to them secretly to deliver Christmas. You can imagine how the legend stuck in the minds of people during those times. And so, later in the mid-18th century, Father Christmas, the personification of Christmas time, became a stock character in Christmas folk plays known as mummers' plays. And mummers used to travel around the villages and towns of Britain with their Christmas performances. And then later still, during the Victorian period, Christmas customs enjoyed a big revival, and the figure of Father Christmas became an emblem of good cheer. And it's about this time that he became associated with merchandise and with shopping. So he wasn't brought in by Coca-Cola. He's always been there. He's always been part of the fabric of this part of the year. He's a midwinter spirit. So remember, he's probably the wandering wizard of the ancient wild hunt. And think about that before you encourage your kids to write secret letters, which I suppose are prayers and wishes, aren't they? Think about that before you get your kids to write secret letters to him and stick them up the chimney. In other words, stick them into heaven for the ancient leader of the wild hunt to grant. Happy Christmas to everybody, and there's my explanation of the character of Father Christmas. Myth and magic news. So this week the BBC reported that the Cottingley Fairies hoax photo has been sold to a new owner for £1,000. The famous 100-year-old photo of the Cottingley Fairies, posed by Elsie Wright and Francis Griffiths in 1917, fooled many into believing in fairies. And Francis confessed the photographs were a hoax in 1983, though she continues to maintain that one of the images was genuine. She admitted that she and her cousin had created the photos by making cardboard cutouts at Cottingley, near Bradford, in England. The photo, entitled Alice and the Fairies, featuring Francis, sold for just over £1,000 in Cirencester, but the image Iris and the Gnome, which was posed by Elsie, went unsold as the reserve price was not met. There were 5 photographs in the series. The 5th photograph is the one which she maintains is of a genuine fairy. These photographs once belonged to the Church of England reverend called George Val Owen, who claimed he received a message or messages via a process known as automatic writing that had been sent to him from spirits or psychic forces. George Val Owen was one of the best-known spiritualists of the early 20th century, and he was a friend of Sherlock Holmes creator Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The photos came about after the 2 girls played together beside a beck, or a stream, at the bottom of their garden in Cottingley, much to their mother's annoyance, and they frequently returned home with wet feet and muddy clothes. In order to stop their mum telling them off, they came up with the excuse that they'd been to see the fairies, and they borrowed Elsie's dad's camera to prove their claim. The father, who was a professional photographer, by the way, he developed the first picture they brought to him, in his own darkroom, and it portrayed Francis behind a bush in the foreground, upon which 4 fairies appeared to be dancing. Knowing his daughter was good at arts and crafts, he dismissed the whole picture and said the fairy figures were cardboard cutouts. But the photographs came public in 1919 when Elsie's mother attended a meeting of the Theosophical Society in Bradford. Their lecture was on fairy life, and she allowed 2 of the fairy photographs that were taken by her daughter to be shown to the audience. These photographs were displayed at the Society's annual conference in Harrogate a few months later. One of the central beliefs of Theosophy is that humanity is undergoing a continuous cycle of evolution towards ever-increasing perfection. So the idea of a spiritual or spiritual beings is not completely absurd to them. The prints, along with the original glass plate negatives, were sent to a photography expert who professed that the photographs were genuine, and the author and the prominent spiritualist Sir Arthur Conan Doyle got involved about that point. He sent the pictures off for more tests, and the results that came back were mixed, but he decided to put all his eggs in one basket and believe Kodak, who said that they were genuine. Conan Doyle remained optimistic the girls had literally taken photos of the real fairies, and in fact that was the commonly held belief right through until Francis's confession in 1983. So, the Cottingley Fairies hoax photo has been sold for £1,000, but the photo of Iris and the gnome was not sold. Magic word of the week. This week, psychopomp. Taken from the Greek, means guide of souls. Psychopompos, or psychopomp, are creatures, spirits, angels, or other deities, whose responsibility it is to escort newly deceased souls from earth and into the afterlife. Most religions have psychopompos. In art, psychopomps often take on anthropomorphic identities such as horses, deer, dogs, ravens, crows, vultures, owls, sparrows and cuckoos. So if you see in art any of those things next to a person who's clearly laying down, then that person's soul is being looked after and escorted to the afterlife. Anubis and Yama were psychopomps, as were the Norse Valkyries, and the angel Azrael carries souls into heaven according to Muslim scripture. In many cultures, a shaman fulfills the role of the psychopomp, and the concept of a midwife to the dying cuts across most religions. A priest or a minister of the sacrament plays the part of psychopomp in Christian tradition. The banshee of Irish and Scottish folklore is a psychopomp because she keens and laments before any impending death, then hangs around to escort the soul into the afterlife. The psychopomp is often considered to be a mediator between the unconscious and the conscious realms. The Grim Reaper is probably the psychopomp that's most familiar to us. I touched upon him in my piece about Lammas, which is in episode 3 of Myth and Magic. Word of the week, psychopomp. Fabulous creature of the week. This week, the Yule Goat. The Yule, Y-U-L-E, goat, is a Scandinavian and North European Christmas symbol. Its origin may be German pagan, and it's thought to have existed over many centuries. Modern representations of the Yule Goat are typically made of straw. The goat is connected to the worship of the Norse god Thor, who rode across the night sky, if you remember, in a chariot drawn by goats. This is a tradition that goes right back to the ancient Indo-European beliefs. The last sheaf of harvest grain is sometimes bundled and specially prepared, and this is credited with magical properties because it's the spirit of the harvest. And the last sheaf of harvest grain is therefore saved for Yule celebrations. At Yule, this straw goat is brought out and perhaps placed alongside the Yule log, and it's called the Yulebocken, Julbocken, the Yulebocken, the Yule goat. The goat is also seen in some cultures to be a spirit who arrives at a house before Christmas time to see that the Yule celebrations are done properly. The Yule goat might also be a folk memory of the horned Krampus, Krampus. Krampus, the horned god, predates Christian tradition and is a strongly held Alpine belief. The Krampus figure is a shaggy-haired, horned and rather demonic-looking half-goat, half-man, and is normally seen holding a birch rod or a staff with which he occasionally swats children. He's the figure who punishes children who might have misbehaved during the year, while St. Nicholas rewards good children with gifts. In this respect, the Yule Goat Krampus character is one of the malevolent companions of St. Nicholas, and these tend to be uncontrolled house spirits like kobolds or elves, and are similar in nature and conduct to Robin Goodfellow, Nachtruprecht, Belsnickel, and the chap I've already mentioned, Black Pete. Jewel booking is a Scandinavian Christmas tradition where people with masks and in Julebocken costumes, and they're known as Jewel bookers, go door to door wassailing and Yule singing, and neighbours try to identify who is hidden under their disguises. If there's a goat in the troop, he's normally the rascally one who performs all the pranks. The fabulous creature of the week this week, the Yule Goat. Wildflower of the week. This week, the mistletoe. Now, one memorable Valentine's Day, so this is not Christmas, but Valentine's Day, 14th of February, my wife and I were given a tour around the mistletoe plants. Mistletoe is Viscum album, in the Palace Gardens of Hampton Court. Now, once I'd been shown around by the very experienced gardener there, and I was shown what and where to look out for mistletoe, I realised, suddenly really, how much mistletoe there actually is up in the tree canopy, especially around here. Now, don't forget I live near the River Thames in a quite wet, moist area in Surrey, and it literally goes almost everywhere. Now, I encourage you to look up into a leafless tree at this time of the year. I know I was looking in 14th of February, but about now, when most of the leaves have dropped, it's a good time to see mistletoe. I encourage you to look up into a leafless tree and seek the witches' brooms which are hidden up there. Mistle is probably the ancient word for twig, so what you're looking for there are twig toes, and I think the toes are the little white berries. Now, mistletoes grow on a wide range of host trees, and most people know that mistletoes are parasitic. Host trees around here tend to be the apple, the lime, linden, hawthorn and poplar. But in fact, mistletoes aren't completely parasitic. They're hemoparasites. In other words, they produce some of their own photosynthesis, at least some of the time, and they have leathery yellow-green leaves to do this. And in most cases, they are probably symbiotic. They have a symbiotic relationship with their host trees. Now, a lot of this science is brand new. A lot of it hasn't been proved yet, but it does seem that when there is an orchard and when that orchard has some mistletoe in it, that orchard remains healthier than an orchard without mistletoe. So there is some symbiotic relationship between the mistletoe and the host tree. Mistletoe seed germinates on the branch of a host tree or shrub, and in the early stages of its development, it's entirely independent of its host. It gradually starts to use some of the minerals and some of the compounds inside the host for its own development. The sticky glutinous seeds are spread by birds that eat them. In fact, the seeds are drupes, not berries. And the mistle thrush is one of these birds. And although the drupes are toxic to humans, and they cause a wide range of symptoms like blurred vision, diarrhea, nausea and vomiting, and they can actually kill, they don't seem to harm the mistle thrush and other birds who eat them. Mistletoes are considered to be a keystone species with a broad array of animals depending on them during the winter months for food. And they also not only eat the berries, they also consume the leaves and the young shoots. And they transfer pollen between plants and disperse the sticky seeds. So rather than being a pest, mistletoe can have a positive effect on a forest or a woodland or an orchard's biodiversity. In Greek mythology, a mistletoe arch, which is known as the Golden Bough, was used by heroes to access the underworld, which is known as the Elysian Fields. I think the idea of mistletoe still being alive when everything else is dead forms part of its magical significance, and it's especially significant for the Druids. The Romans associated mistletoe with peace and love and understanding, and they hung it over their doorways to protect the household during the festival of Saturnalia, which was 17th to the 23rd of December. So when we hang mistletoe around our house, we're actually just doing something that the Romans have been doing for many, many hundreds of years. And it's to do with Saturnalia, not to do with Christmas. So going back to the Druids, before the Romans appeared in the British Isles, the Druids performed rituals that involved oak and mistletoe. And it said that a Druid priest would wear white vestments, and he'd climb the oak tree on the 6th day of the moon, and with a sickle he'd cut down the mistletoe that he'd catch in a white cloak. It said that they would drink the mistletoe, which would have been a dangerous idea, but apparently it could aid in fertility, especially if an animal was barren, and it could be used as an antidote for poisons. Now, although mistletoe continued to be associated with fertility and vitality through the Middle Ages, it also began to be used as a decoration under which lovers were expected to kiss. That's because it has a certain degree of sexual connotation, because the white drupes were considered to be like semen. Anyway, it was also used by householders, probably as from my folk memory of the Saturnalia festivals. It was used by householders to protect their houses from witches and demons, so they'd hang it above the door. Now, according to custom, so try to remember this if you're using a mistletoe this year. According to custom, mistletoe must not touch the ground between its cutting and its removal. It must remain hanging throughout the year, and if it does so, then it will preserve your house from lightning or fire. You can hang it all year until it's replaced the following Christmas Eve by the new mistletoe. Mistletoe is the state floral emblem of Oklahoma and the county flower of Herefordshire. Every year, the UK town of Tenbury Wells holds a mistletoe festival, and it crowns a mistletoe queen. The wildflower of the week, mistletoe. If I don't speak to you before Christmas, or if you don't hear from me before Christmas, have a wonderful Christmas time, and I wish you and your family the warmest greetings of the season, and I hope you have a great new year. And please make sure that you follow Myth and Magic, a fantasy writer's kit bag, in the new year, and tell all your friends about it. And I look forward to giving you more information and fantasy fiction, fables, myths and fun in 2020.